Continuing this chapter on treatment of psychological disorders, we're going to start by talking about our psychological treatments. And like I said at the end of the last recording, our psychological strategies are actually quite a few different topics. So we're going to start talking psychodynamic and humanistic therapies. And those terms should be very familiar because we keep talking about our psychodynamic perspective, our humanistic perspective. And those two often come up as a compare and contrast, starting with psychodynamic, followed up with the contrasting humanistic, and then we'll move on into cognitive and behavioral, which themselves exist on their own spectrum. But we'll do the first two together, then we'll do the next two, and then we'll move on into biological treatments. But starting with our psychological treatments, so all of these psychological treatments are going to be looking at modifying our environment. And we're specifically going to start looking at therapeutic approaches in the traditional sense of when you think of therapy, you think of meeting with a therapist and talking about sort of whatever your symptoms are and other things. So we're going to see that depending on which therapy we're looking at and even which perspective that therapy falls under, what's discussed between therapist and client tends to differ dramatically. But first off, broad topics. What do we mean when we use the term psychotherapy? It sounds really complicated, but it's literally the term where we're talking about the interaction between a therapist and a client. So the client is the individual with a psychological problem that they're seeking treatment for, and the clinician is our therapist. So we'll see those as general terms. Sometimes you'll see psychotherapy called talk therapy, specifically because it's an interaction, usually talking back and forth between the therapist and the client. Now, again, we will see a dramatic difference in the role of the therapist and the client depending on the specific treatment type, but the basic idea is that there is this interaction, and anywhere we have a therapist and client, it's going to fall under that broad heading. We'll also sometimes see the term eclectic psychotherapy. And this term just relates to the idea that not all therapists are going to stick to one specific type of psychotherapy. In practice, a lot of therapists are going to pull inspiration from multiple areas of psychotherapy. So they might have some of their approaches relate to a cognitive behavioral approach. Maybe some of them are going to be more psychodynamic leaning. But this just means that while we talk about these as distinctive categories and separate types of treatments, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So different therapists will have different preferences in which types of approaches they use, and they are not limited within any one category. Over on the side here, we see that some of the most common strategies that are employed today are going to fall in that cognitive and behavioral category. So we'll spend a bunch of time on those, but we'll also see our interpersonal and psychodynamic perspectives play a huge role, and even our humanistic and existential, those are still a fairly large chunk. So lots of diversity in the strategies that are used today, but we're going to touch a little bit on some of the history of how these different treatment approaches came about and what each of them focus on and how they compare with one another. So starting off with our psychodynamic psychotherapies, try to say that quickly, but this is looking at that psychodynamic perspective. And all of the things we've talked about so far this semester with a psychodynamic perspective are still holding. So when we see psychodynamic, we should immediately think of Freud. And that's because Freud established this field and proposed the first of our psychodynamic therapies, which is psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is a treatment strategy that's based on our assumption that humans are born with this innate drive. So we have our sexual and aggressive urges that are going to strongly impact our behaviors. This was talked about extensively in the chapter on personality, where we look at the fact that people are trying to suppress these innate urges that are trying to sort of bubble up and get expressed in our day-to-day lives. And so we spend a lot of time looking at things like our defense mechanisms, our ways of sort of pushing these urges down and having them not impact our day-to-day lives. As always, when we're looking at Freud, there's a really strong focus on early childhood experiences. So with our personality models and stressing the fact that a lot of his original theories were very much focused on your first, say, 5 to 10 years of life, and the fact that those early experiences could have long term impacts on how you behave, how your personality settles, what kinds of actions you tend to overtake. This all lines up with that. So, this was our first of the psychodynamic therapies that was proposed, but it's mostly been replaced by more modern approaches. So, we'll look at one of the more common modern psychotherapies, but or psychodynamic psychotherapies. But this is where it all started. So obviously based on Freudian principles, so it lines up with what we've talked about before. Here, the goal in psychoanalysis is to have patients achieve insight. So achieving insight just means that people, the clients, are going to attain conscious awareness of their underlying problems. So they're looking at the psychodynamics is just talking about the fact that there are sort of these underlying psychological processes that are influencing your behavior. So the goal in the long term is looking at these weird unconscious behaviors, these unconscious factors, and those internal conflicts that are operating in our unconscious well beyond our conscious mind. So we're trying to focus on the stuff that is usually well outside of the realm of stuff we could be aware of. And he's trying to shine a light into that deep, dark unconscious to try and understand where our maladaptive behaviors are coming from. And by adjusting our behavior, maybe we're going to look at some of the, by adjusting our behavior, we can find where those problems came from and maybe start changing them and sort of change our framework as we move forward. All right, tools. So how do we actually do this? Because that sounds really abstract and kind of awkward to talk about. But if Freud is trying to get at these deep, dark, subconscious things, especially focusing on those urges, and with that focus on our defense mechanisms, trying to repress and maybe hide some of those urges through maladaptive ways, how do we actually get at that information? Same as when we talked personality, where we have a lot of maybe vague and subjectively interpretable tests. Free association is going to be one of the common tools here. I think we've talked about this before, but this is going to be I'm going to say something as the therapist, and the client is then going to say the first thing that pops into their mind. We want them to show what it is that's easily accessible in their mind, with the idea that that's going to give some insight into what's going on behind the scenes. So they're talking about their thoughts, their feelings. If I show you an image, what is it that pops into your head? And the goal here is to look at maybe what's being blocked from being recalled. So if we had somebody who was maybe hesitant to say something, I ask you to associate something with a particular word, and it takes you a really long time to come up with something. Freud might latch on to that and say that you're censoring yourself, you're trying not to say something, and therefore this concept is tied to some underlying problem. And this is part of what we typically think of when you think of sort of the stereotypical therapy approach where you're reclining on a couch in a dark office and you have your therapist sort of dictating what you do and how you do it. That lines up with psychoanalysis. That's where that idea came from. We also see some more abstract concepts like dream interpretation, which we've said before are focusing on the fact that our unconscious mind is going to be sort of bringing things to the surface in our dreams. If we look at some of our different theories on where dreams come from, Freud's dream theory is actually talking about the protective quality of dreams, where he would say that dreams are like our safe space to express our impulses, fantasies, and those deep, dark urges that we keep talking about. So, dreams are going to be a way to almost vent off some of that psychic steam or psychic energy that's building up from conflicts. And therefore, the content of our dreams, what it is that we dream about, can give insight into what's going on internally. And again, we run into some issues where he doesn't necessarily think that the face value content of a dream is actually useful. So, somebody dreaming about a normal day, he would try and look deeper. He'd try and look at some of the content that's hidden behind the scenes. So, maybe we'd interpret something like picking a bunch of flowers is tied to mortality and the fact that the plants are not going to survive, or something like that. There's all sorts of different handbooks on how he would interpret these sort of symbolic things hidden in our dreams, that sort of under the surface content. But as we're going to find between free association, dream interpretation, and even things like looking at say, abstract photos, so our Rorschach test, ink blots, and interpreting images, and what do you see in this weird shape, all of those are very subjective. So that ties into our critical evaluation of this idea, this type of therapy, where it's very heavily influenced by the interpretation of the therapist themselves. So this is very subjective, very open to interpretation. There are no really right or wrong answers, and there are no standards. So each individual will have different ways of interpreting the same information, which makes it really hard to look at the effectiveness of this therapeutic approach. This is very therapist driven. So the statements by the therapist are what control the direction of the session. So the therapist is going to provide insight. They're going to make statements about what certain things in their dreams mean, or what kinds of connections we're finding. And this ends up being sort of the client's sort of interpretation, their understanding is strongly influenced by the information laid out by the therapist. The issue, or I guess one of the issues with this, is the fact that the client has to actually arrive at this insight themselves. So, yes, the therapist can tell them what they think is going on, but in order to actually successfully achieve insight, the client must come to that realization, must sort of internalize it themselves. So, the therapist is driving everything, they're going to be pushing and leading this process, but the client needs to come to terms with it themselves. This means that it can be a very time consuming process. And if we remember back to how Freud operated, he actually ended up spending years and years and years with some of his patients to try and understand every detail of their lives that could be sort of hidden in their subconscious. And again, limited evidence for effectiveness, because with such a subjective approach, it's actually very challenging to find support for it being helpful. One of the other issues with that sort of effectiveness is that with psychoanalysis, the goal was more on understanding why people were behaving the way they were and what was going on underneath the surface, and a lot less of a focus on how to change that and maybe alleviate symptoms. The idea being that symptoms might improve as understanding was gained, but that wasn't necessarily the driving force behind the therapies. So, yeah, important considerations when we're thinking about this particular type of therapy, but it also explains why it was pretty much completely replaced by other types of therapy. Not to say that all psychodynamic therapies have been completely removed. There are still some that are in practice, and some of the principles have been folded into other types of therapies, but it's not one of the more common types. In terms of modern psychodynamic therapies, interpersonal psychotherapy, or IPT, is one of the most common. So this is very different from classical psychoanalysis because it's a modern approach. So here, our treatment is focusing on improving our current interpersonal relationships to try and reduce the symptoms that our clients are experiencing. So already we're seeing a difference here where instead of focusing on sort of the unconscious and these innate urges, we're actually focusing on interactions with others. And specifically, treatment, reduction of symptoms is one of the primary focuses. So, very, very different from psychoanalysis. Some of the specific goals, they might focus on helping people handle grief, looking at role disputes. So if we're looking at interpersonal relationships, what are the roles that each of those individuals takes on within a relationship? And is there a way to maybe find compromise, find balance? Role transitions is if your role needs to be changing and adapting. Maybe you're changing your position at work. Maybe you're getting promoted. Or maybe somebody else is coming in and now you have to share responsibilities. There's also interpersonal deficits. So maybe you're not good at interpersonal relationships, You're not good at interacting with others. Could we maybe provide skills that would help with that? So very, very different on the surface, but it's not completely different from our psychoanalysis. It's still a psychodynamic perspective. We do focus a lot more on the present than on the past, like psychoanalysis did. It doesn't deny the fact that childhood experiences can still influence your current behavior, but that wasn't the only focus. We're still, again, focusing on symptom reduction. That's still important, but understanding why people are behaving the way that they are and what might be going on in their unconscious mind is still considered an important part of this, but it's not the main focus. So we still acknowledge that there might be unconscious forces driving our behaviors, but that's not the only thing that we consider. One last thing to note about interpersonal psychotherapy before we move on into humanistic therapies, IPT is actually something that we would call a brief psychodynamic therapy. And it seems like a really weird name to it, but it's called a brief therapy because, unlike our original psychoanalysis, IPT and other brief psychotherapies tend to take a lot less time. This is usually because there's maybe a specific symptom or a specific problem that they're trying to focus on, and therefore there's a more targeted approach, and it's something that therefore is not going to take as long to work through. Whereas with psychoanalysis, the goal was to understand absolutely everything that was driving an individual's personality as a whole, with that focus on their subconscious or unconscious. So here, having more of a targeted approach means that they can be completed more quickly. So if you were wondering why we don't see IPT on that map at the beginning of this section, it's because it falls under the broader category of a brief psychodynamic therapy. As always, we move from our psychodynamic perspective to the humanistic perspective, and the same holds for our therapeutic approaches, where our humanistic psychotherapies came about in the sort of mid 20th century. We're going to be looking around sort of the 60s and 70s. This started a little bit earlier than that, peaked in the 60s and 70s, and then have stuck around. They're not completely gone, they're still fairly common, but that's when they were the most common. But why did they come about? Well, our humanistic perspective is very much in contrast to the psychodynamic perspective. So all of our humanistic psychologists basically said that psychodynamic perspectives hold a very, very negative view of human nature. Basically saying that humans are these sort of innate sexual and aggressive creatures that are operating on instincts and urges, and the fact that that kind of an approach and focusing on that as the driving force behind human behavior is really selling humans short. So, our humanistic psychologists said that we should really focus on a more positive and intentional or conscious view of how we act and why. So, here, for all of our humanistic psychotherapies, our primary focus is based around the idea that we have an innate tendency to strive for personal improvement and growth. So, saying that humans are always trying to improve themselves, they're always trying to grow and gain experiences and better themselves. So, this is very much a different approach and a completely dramatic swing away from those negative views from our psychodynamic perspectives. Again, we're focusing a lot on conscious control of behavior and especially people taking responsibility for their actions rather than sort of throwing your hands in the air and saying, oh, yeah, they act like that because of these unconscious biological urges. We're saying that people choose to act the way that they do. And therefore, if we're going to have healthy behavior, they need to take responsibility for that and consciously choose behaviors that allow for growth and improvement. And if we're seeing disordered behavior, those symptoms are coming from something that's blocking the ability to have that conscious control or take responsibility. We're still going to acknowledge the fact that our past experiences can shape our current behavior, but again, with a less directed focus, unlike where Freud focused on childhood and specific urges that are repressed. Here would be more of our prior experiences and the support and the environment in which we were raised are going to influence how we interact with our environment as we move forward. So, starting off, talking about the sort of starting point here. So, the driving force behind our humanistic psychotherapies always comes back to client centered or person centered therapy. So, we've probably mentioned Carl Rogers a few times throughout the semester, talking about our humanistic perspective, but Carl Rogers developed our client centered therapies. So, again, this started in the early 40s into the 50s and continued to grow in popularity into the 60s and 70s. And here, our treatment is focusing on, again, the individual tendency to strive for growth, just like all the other humanistic approaches. But now we're saying that failure to reach one's potential can have detrimental effects on our actions. And the thing that makes this client centered therapy so important and so influential is the fact that our focus here is on the therapeutic environment. So rather than our sort of hierarchical approach that was taken with our psychoanalysis, where you have Freud, the therapist, sort of dictating what the client is supposed to do and how they should interpret information, Rogers said that we should actually come to therapy as equals. The therapist and the client are going to be meeting on equal ground. They're going to have a back and forth conversation where both of them contribute to the discussion. And instead of just having the therapist determine what approaches and what specific activities are going to be best and what the client should do at their behest, Rogers said that the client should have a say in what we do. They should have a say in what kinds of activities are going to help. So to focus on what's here in the point, so yes, the therapeutic environment is really important. And specifically, we want an accepting and genuine therapist who's going to help create an environment where people feel comfortable. They feel accepted. It's going to help foster growth. They're going to feel like they can experiment. They can be vulnerable. They can talk about things in a way they might not have been comfortable to before. So by establishing this environment and letting you meet a therapist as equals, it's going to help allow people to grow and change and improve any of those behaviors they were having issues with. Now, I did mention that while our childhood experiences aren't as core and critical as what Freud had started out with our client centered therapy, we do acknowledge that these childhood experiences are going to shape how people interact with their environment. I already said that part. But here, the focus being that sometimes interactions, especially with parents and caregivers, can actually establish sort of unrealistic or maladaptive standards when we try and capture their feelings of self worth. So I think back in the personality chapter, we talked about conditional versus unconditional positive regard, where we had said that if we have unconditional positive regard, it means that you feel like your actions, you can do things that are good or bad, but you're still going to get love and affection and care from those around you. In that case, we're saying that your actions are not going to influence whether people give you affection and love. It's unconditional. Whereas conditional positive regard means that we've set up conditions of worth, where you only have worth or value as an individual if you follow the rules laid out for you. So if a parent sets these conditions of worth, they might say that you are only worthy of affection if you achieve good grades in school, or if you follow the rules and don't get in trouble. In those cases, individuals can grow up feeling like they only have value, they only have worth if they can meet those standards. And they might find standards set by others in their environment as adults, and they might feel like they're not achieving those standards. So they're going to feel unfulfilled by failing to reach those standards because they've learned in the past that not meeting standards means that you don't have value or worth as an individual. And that kind of maladaptive framework means that as an adult, you might feel unfulfilled, unmotivated. You might not feel confident and safe to explore and grow as an individual. So again, lots of concepts tying together. Since our client-centered therapy is very much focused on changing this relationship between the client and therapist, it makes sense that there are certain qualities that the therapist should possess in order to sort of be effective in their role. So we have three major things that play a role here. Unconditional positive regard makes sense with what we've just talked about. With unconditional positive regard from the therapist, they're going to be accepting the client without judgment or evaluation, again, to foster that environment where they feel safe to express themselves. They feel like their worth is not going to go away if they admit to doing something. So they're going to be feeling safe, supported, and not judged. We also can talk about empathy. So we would like the therapist to be able to view the world through the client's eyes, where they can understand where the client has come from. If you feel like somebody else understands your experience and where you're coming from and how you've experienced this, again, you're going to feel more comfortable sharing and interacting. You're going to feel more like equals. You're going to feel less judged. And then the last point here, genuineness or congruence, is basically when we're finding that there's consistency between the therapist's feelings and behaviors. Basically, you don't want the therapist to sort of say that they agree with you, but maybe still be a little bit judgy of your actions. If we have that incongruence, we're basically seeing that maybe they're acting like they support me, that they have this unconditional positive regard and empathy, so we want congruence so that we're more comfortable with that sort of interaction. We know that they have genuine empathy, genuine regard for us as a person, and therefore, again, continuing to establish that strong and safe environment, which is going to set us up to have more effective approaches towards therapy. Now, to end our humanistic psychotherapies, we're going to talk about Gestalt therapy. So another term that might have come up earlier on, but Gestalt is a term that just means the organized whole. So usually we'll talk about Gestalt psychology, looking at how humans put things together, talking about the fact that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So especially when we look at perception, Gestalt psychology and Gestalt organization focus on the fact that small individual components, all the different elements in a perceptual scene, tend to get organized together, and we will interpret it as a collective scene. We will determine meaning from all those isolated elements by putting them together in a logical way. So the term is actually still valid here. So Gestalt therapy is focusing on sort of trying to get this holistic awareness and understanding of stuff going on behind the scenes in terms of, say, consciousness and what's driving our behaviors. So specifically, we're focusing on trying to get a client more aware of their thoughts, their actions, their experiences, how they feel about things. And by doing so, by gaining that awareness, they're able to take responsibility for those actions and thoughts and behaviors, but also maybe change them. Because once you're aware of them, you might choose to do something different in the future. So that connection to the Gestalt term is that they're trying to focus on making a client whole again by becoming holistically aware of all of these different aspects that might be influencing their actions. So this is trying to get clients more in touch with their own inner selves and the things that are motivating their behaviors. This, again, very different from a lot of our other perspectives and therapeutic approaches we've talked about before. So unlike all the others where it's usually a one-on-one between a therapist and a client, Gestalt therapy is usually carried out in groups. Sometimes it is still one-on-one, but it can be done where you might have groups talk to each other. They might also sort of take a more active role in this process. So there's a lot of sort of dramatic therapeutic approaches here. So they stress things like role play, putting yourself into someone else's shoes. One of the more famous techniques is called the empty chair technique. And this is where you're effectively going to talk to the chair. So you are yourself talking to someone. Say you have issues with a parental figure. So you are going to talk to that chair as if that parental figure was sitting there. You would then say, sit in the chair and talk back, taking on the role of the parent and responding as you think they would. By doing this, you're hoping that the client will sort of get these feelings and awareness and sort of understanding in terms of both their own experiences, but they might also come to understand the perspective of the person who they're talking to or talking as. So in this case, they might come up with maybe there's some unresolved issues within that relationship. Maybe they're starting to understand that they don't understand someone's motivations. So it's meant to provide insight into that person and how they interact with that person and whatever else they can dredge up in terms of their own experiences. So, very dramatic, very active, usually involving role play or imagining talking to someone or interacting with someone to try and improve your understanding. So, again, very much focusing on what you think, actively what you're doing, what you're experiencing, how you're interpreting information, and more. So, very, very different from the other types we've talked about so far.